And today we'll be discussing Let's End Whack-A-Mole, which I'm sure you can all agree is something that really does need to end for everyone around ASEAN region and beyond. So here to discuss the session today is Joyce Ang from Lazada, Serena Chen from Carousel, Lily Sen from Amcor Flexibles Asia Pacific, and to lead off this discussion, Alvin Kwan from CSC. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Rebecca. Hi, everyone. So first of all, let me introduce ourselves, and I'll introduce the session as well, and then I'll ask the panelists to introduce themselves as well. So the topic today is Let's End Whack-A-Mole. A very big topic, very ambitious, I would say. I don't think we'll have a solution for you to actually stop or end Whack-A-Mole, but hopefully by the end of the session today, we have a better idea of how we can work together to actually put an end to it eventually. So for the purpose of the discussions, the definition of Whack-A-Mole would be limited to infringing issues on e-commerce platform today. So we won't be covering like infringing issues in general online, like on the website or app store and anything like that. So it'll be more anti-counterfeit focus. But I think we can also be expanding a little bit beyond that as well, because as part of this discussion, we nevertheless will go into other IP issues faced by brand owners and platform related. So there are things like trademark abuse, apparel imports, counterfeiting, and stuff like that. We won't go into like deep dive into each and every one of it, but I think the definition of the lack of clarity on some of these issues might be contributing factors as well. So let me introduce myself first. My name is Alvin Kwan. I'm the regional director of CSC. We are a global online brand protection monitoring service provider. So I've been in the industry for quite a long time. 15 years or something like that. So I have seen a fair share of these issues experienced by both the platforms and also the brand owner side, and from a vendor perspective as well. I actually did a session, a keynote on the same topic early in the year with WTL as well. So, but you won't be hearing from me today. You'll be hearing from an even better speaker today. So we have Joyce, Lily, and Serena. So let me pass to them for a brief self-introduction. Can I have Joyce, Lily, and then Serena give some time to introduce yourself first? Thank you.
Sure. Thanks, Alvin. Hi, everyone. My name is Joyce Ang, and I'm based in Singapore. I'm a senior vice president with Lazada in the intellectual property rights protection team. And it's my pleasure to be here today. Thank you.
Thanks, Joyce. Thanks, Alvin. Hi, everybody. I'm Lily Chen. I'm the general counsel for what we call the Amcor Flexibles Asia Pacific Business Group. I'm based in Singapore. So Amcor, for those who are unfamiliar with the brand, is a B2B business. We manufacture packaging for obviously consumer-facing industries. So I'm very happy to be here today. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Lily, Joyce, and Alvin. So hi, everyone. I'm Serena. I'm the legal director of Carousel. For those who may or may not know us, we're a classifieds platform. So what we actually do is we are here to actually inspire the world to make more possible for everyone. So really happy to be here today and would be grateful to have the time to share with everyone and learn from everyone as well.
So thank you all. So in the discussion today, I think in general we'll have kind of three areas that we cover. First of all, we're probably going to talk about the root cause of the Whack-A-Mole situation. Then we are going to talk about what would you imagine as a world without this? How does it actually look like? And then lastly, how do we achieve that state? So we'll have a loose conversation. This is just a loose guideline. We'll probably depending on what the speakers talking about, and we'll follow from there. But let me start this discussion first. So everyone, free flow. Do you agree we are in a state of Whack-A-Mole at the moment? And if so, who is responsible for it? Anyone can pick it up, or I can take some. Joyce, maybe you can go first.
Hi, Alvin. Sorry, I had some problem unmuting myself. Well, I think if Whack-A-Mole's definition is about having to go online. Okay, so I think one way to look at it is in the physical world. When you find a store or you find a counterfeiter, you expect that you send a letter and this counterfeiter would, comply. Or if you took further steps beyond sending the letter or you took legal action, then the counterfeiter would eventually stop. So physically, you're not supposed to find the same store with the same infringing products in that locality. But then, of course, if you take the definition a little wider, then technically the counterfeiter can just move shop. From one location, he could shift to a whole different locality. That could still be whack-a-mole. But I guess from brand protection perspective, the fact that something has been done to the physical shop and is no longer there does offer some level of consolation to the brand protection manager. Online space is different, right? Because the amount of time and effort that it takes to shift locality and move physical store is not the same when it's an online space. Sellers can move around the online space pretty easily and at a very low cost. So any kind of enforcement action that is being taken with vis-a-vis an online shop, if it's confined to an online environment, it may seem like the whack-a-mole situation is more apparent because you see the same seller coming up again, or you see that the products get relisted again. And this is with much lesser difficulty on the part of the seller, I think. So I think that's what brand protection managers are struggling with, drawing this parallel between physical and online. Yeah.
Thanks, Joyce. If I can also maybe add to that, I think we are also seeing a particular situation now, particularly as bad actors actually move to classifieds or online platforms in that sense. You see that they get very creative, and some of the actions that we're taking now to actually combat counterfeits on the platforms are actually targeting what we possibly could call the low-hanging fruits. So like keyword listing, keyword filters, but you see that they pick up on these things really quickly, the way they change the terms that they're using, the way they change how they are actually phrasing some of these things, and they could completely. So effectively what is happening could potentially be a situation where we're funneling them down this particular route where it's even harder for us to be able to find them. So we see these trends actually happening now because of some of the maybe band-aid exercises that we're actually doing or could do as platform and brand owners as well.
Yeah, thanks, Joyce and Serena. I think, this is an Alvin for the introduction. Whack-a-mole is a really, as simple as it sounds, it's actually quite a complicated concept, especially as both Joyce and Serena rightly said, you translate to the online environment. And to I guess going directly to the question of, are we in a state of whack-a-mole? I don't necessarily think it's to say that we're in a state of whack-a-mole now. I think the issue, especially now, given the global pandemic, which is continuing throughout, much of the world and the region, is that platforms and stores which haven't ordinarily had an online presence have had to move online, which therefore also affords much more of an opportunity for so-called bad actors to actually prey on such vulnerabilities. And so what you are seeing now, I at least from my experience and speaking to our stakeholders, is that you are seeing a proliferation of different actors who you may not have seen in the past. And this is including both sophisticated actors who are perhaps more resourced at actually overcoming some of the challenges which legal teams and enforcement try to put in place to stop the issue and proliferation, as compared to more smaller players who sometimes fly under the radar and can create the same level of issue, but not as noticed because of the size and perhaps the fact they don't have the same resourcing. So it's a very complicated issue, and it's one that I think maybe we'll get to this in a moment, but it's not one that has an easy remedy or an easy band-aid fix. But the issue is because of the state of the regulation and the way that we interact, and the speed, the rapidity, is that you actually have to try and apply some sort of band-aid actions that may not necessarily help to identify and treat the root cause.
It's interesting. I think we already bring us, quite a few set of issues that are that's contributing to this. But I want to ask you further on this because there's certainly a lot of actors related to this issue, and each of them contributing to several different areas. So I think we bring up in one of your reply about the how the infringer it is much lower cost and much easier for them to switch targets. So that's contribute to them keep coming back to the online counterfeiting issues. We also bring up about the law and the law enforcement as well, because they are also a factor. Certainly, one of the party that needs to get involved is the brand owners themselves as well. What do you think are their responsibility in this issue? Is there any party that you think would be, the main party? If we are they are the cause, and they have to bear the main responsibility. Is there anyone that you would say something like that?
Maybe if I can start off with this, and it will be interesting to see what Lily and Joyce think as well. So I personally think it's more of a collaborative effort. It has to be a combined effort of all three parties, actually, the brand owners, the platforms, and the law enforcement agencies as well. A simple reason, at least from my end, without oversimplifying it, would be that most platforms don't have the knowledge of being able to identify counterfeits to the level that the brand owners would have. So like we alluded to earlier in this part of this discussion is that a number of it could be the low-hanging fruit, the ones that are easier to identify, but it may be but there may be a lot others that go unnoticed that we actually need the indication from brand owners as well. And of course, there are certain difficulties that we also may face. And I think this group will also discuss in a moment in relation to data protection, whether or not there's a free flow of information that we can actually send to brand protection owners as well to help them in actually combating some of the counterfeit issues that we see. And with that, I think then the law enforcement agencies play a very big part also in being able to facilitate this flow of data and also being able to enforce a number of
If I may just jump on and add to Serena's point, right? I think, Alvin, in my view, there isn't like one singular party that is responsible for this state of affairs. Because if it were that simple, then, we would have solved the problem yonks ago. So it is like Lily has said, right? It is a much more complicated issue. Just this idea of being able to end the whack-a-mole. It's almost like saying we can eradicate counterfeiting issues across the globe. But I think Serena has also brought up a really good observation, which is I think even though there isn't like a one sole overriding contribution factor, there are a few stakeholders that we can identify that can go in and through their collaboration together will actually make a real difference in mitigating some of these whack-a-mole problems. And I agree that it is a collaboration between platform brand owners and law enforcement agencies, because together the three parties would hold all the relevant critical pieces of information, or if I should say, from a more legal analysis perspective, right? These three parties hold the critical relevant facts or evidence that is actually going to mount a successful case if and when we have that law prosecution or enforcement action.
Yeah, I wholeheartedly agree with Serena and Joyce that this is completely a collaboratory action that needs to happen between brand owner, platform, and law enforcement. I guess that the key thing here is to not underemphasize the fact that each of these players does have a role, in terms of contributing towards the mitigation factors. And for example, when we're working with brand owners and helping them to devise their IP strategy, that has to be one and core to, fundamentally supporting both platforms and law enforcement agencies to actually go in and actually do their part as part of the process. And what do I mean by that? For example, take a brand owner who has a particular product that it has traditionally had in store, and now, given the situation, has had to move to online platforms. So, may be naive, may not be naive to the actual online world. But, what that brand owner needs to think about is, in terms of its overall protection strategy, has it put in place what it would need to be in place in order to effect an effective enforcement strategy if you were to work with a platform and the enforcement agency? For example, trademark registrations. If you don't have that in place, it can make it very difficult in order to try and effect an effective strategy. So, it's important that each party plays its role, and, platforms can only do so much. For example, brand owners, if they are, part of their messaging to their consumers needs to be about the importance or the authenticity about their product as an original manufacturer. Why is it important from a health, safety, whatever it might be perspective? What is the value proposition that you bring, and why their customers need to be alert, and also helping that brand owner to identify the issues and reporting that. That needs to be part of the dialogue and part of the discussion that's built into the overall process.
Yeah, interesting. I certainly wholeheartedly agree. This needs to be a cooperative, affairs to resolve the problem. But let me be the devil advocate and just ask this question. It's not like people are uncooperative, right? So people try to be cooperative to solve this problem. I think a lot of the brand protection manager that I know have a really close relationship with the custom, with the law enforcement, and a lot of the platforms actually have platform cooperation program launched already. So if everyone try to be cooperative already, why do we still see this problem? What do you think is still lagging at the moment? That might be a difficult question, but Lily, maybe you can go first.
Maybe I'll start off, and I think it's everyone's intent to apply their best efforts to try and overcome the issue. And again, it's not a novel issue; it's been around for years and years and years. Even before we moved to the online world, it's just become more of a complicated scenario, given that we are on online platforms. But one of the challenges that I think brand owners, platforms, and law enforcement face is the fact that certain laws can be prohibitive in terms of being actually able to identify and use certain information. And you look, for example, at things such as, not necessarily in this region, but relevant, things like GDPR, which completely, enable redacting of information, which means that people cannot even gather data relating to who's accessing what particular page is uploading, et cetera, et cetera. So it's this complicated mixture, especially in this region, whereby each country has its own set of local laws and policies, which is understandable. We have to respect that, that right of sovereignty. But, what perhaps is missing is a more defined set of guidelines or standards for law enforcement and lawmakers to perhaps follow. And perhaps Joyce and Serena, I'm not sure if you agree, but you may want to build on what I've just explained.
Okay, I'll go next. I think, we touched upon this point earlier, but I think it cannot be overemphasized that the scale of the problem has really grown tremendously because of this shift from offline to online. And I think a lot of the so consumers are the first to pivot, right? They're quite able to switch quite easily from their preference in terms of exercising their preferences, to go from buying something in a physical store to shopping online. And I guess with COVID, it's just, sometimes there is no choice. It's just a matter of getting access to the goods that you want only via an online channel. But if you think about it from the three-party framework that we were discussing, now obviously the platforms we are also learning, because this is a whole new industry. There isn't a lot of guidance that we can't look at something before that has been done and say that this is the framework and this is the guideline. And there's a lot of experimentation that is innate in a tech or a startup e-commerce type of a industry. There's a lot of experiment as to how to do a business and new business models, right? So in a way, there's some experimenting there, and there is no playbook that we can refer back. Now, the last component, the third stakeholder I want to mention is the law enforcement agencies. Now, what is the law enforcement agencies' mindset? I think because we all agree, I think, to some extent that this whole e-commerce explosion shift from offline to online is happening at a breakneck speed, faster than faster than lawmakers or regulators can put everybody in the same room and have a discussion about it. And so for the law enforcement agencies, they are in some way still in the mindset, I think, where they're expecting a lot more physical attributes to a case. They want to know where is the I suppose maybe a warehouse location, like right from the get-go. They would much rather you present a investigation lead, right, where they could go and look at a physical location and carry out what I would call a very traditional way of investigation. But then, because of the e-commerce angle to this, the investigation can't just be physical, right? It's got to be physical plus a lot of data science and data analytics work. And the question, I guess, is given the scale that we're talking about here, whether or not it's realistic to expect that we will have that capabilities so soon.
Yeah, well, as a vendor, we typically asked by brand owners to provide information like this, so that they can conduct further actions and stuff like that. So we may detect a seller called Happy Seller 123. But that information doesn't give anything for the law enforcement to action anything. But if we are to expect to gather more data, then we can, because of the privacy law that we mentioned. So that's actually a good pivot to one of the items Serena bring up before as well, because the whole idea about the big data, the data sharing side of things, because I think we are actually in a kind of a chicken egg situation sometimes. We first have to gather data enough data to build a case, so that we can get the law enforcement to get involved. But we can't get the data without law enforcement getting involved in the beginning. So, Serena, I know you have a lot of experience in data privacy. What's your thought about this? Do you think this is a problem that we're facing? Anything you want to add on that?
Thanks, Alban. So I think you brought up quite a few good points here, and also maybe back to your earlier question about if we had an ideal world, what would it be like? I think it's specific to maybe data protection or sharing of this information. It could be something that if ever we ever get to that state where if we want to actually eradicate bad actors on the platform to the extent possible, the facilitation of, for example, like to a number of points that both Lily and Joyce raised earlier as well, that it's very easy to actually go onto a new platform or have a new identity on a new platform and be able to sell items. But if we are able to facilitate the sharing of information to identify the actual group or individuals who are behind, say, Carousel's platform and then Lazada's platform, and be able to share that information so that it doesn't replicate, the seller is not able to replicate across the different platforms. I think it's something potentially that could help with this particular issue that we are facing. But like you rightly pointed out, I think right now there are number of difficulties. And to Lily's point as well, different countries or different jurisdictions have different regulations as well. Some countries see individual business data as private personal data. Some countries don't. And then we also have that difficulty, and also to Joyce's point earlier as well, that the business models are changing so quickly. The ecosystem itself is still developing to be able to just within this group itself, you see the Lazada's business model and Carousel's business model are completely different. We could have casual sellers, merchants, people who are not doing it for business, and whether then law agencies are actually targeting smaller individual sellers, or are they targeting the big organizations who are actually doing these things. I think I probably just made the issue a bit more complicated and derailed from what we were discussing earlier in relation to data protection. But yeah, I think that we see government agencies actually trying as well, and brand owners as well, trying to work on a collaborative joint effort to target these issues. But because there are quite a number of different bodies or stakeholders in that sense, and getting across that hurdle about data protection and what it means for each business in each different jurisdiction is something that still needs to be worked on.
So I want to get Joyce and Lily's opinion, but before I do so, let me just add one more point. When we talk about this data privacy issue, I think the trend is actually going the other way, right? So all the data privacy law is actually worsening the issue because the less that we can share. If you look at the data privacy law about GDPR or the new one in China, everyone is basically saying that they can't share any data. So in light of this, what do you think? If to solve the problem, we have to be more open, more collaborative, sharing more data, be more transparent. But the law actually moving away from that, prohibiting us from sharing. How do we actually deal with this issue?
It's a really good question, I think, Alvin, and you're absolutely spot on in identifying the fact that, in fact, each country across the Asia-Pacific region is developing a more robust set of laws, which are effectively, which in many cases are actually stronger than what the GDPR initially is classified. So it creates that additional challenge, and you still have people who are very strongly advocating for the presence of these laws in order to protect, the sanctity of personal information and company information. So it makes it very challenging. But, I guess to your question of what, what can be done in order to help businesses and even consumers, because remember, at the end of the day, yes, brand owners are affected, platforms are clearly affected as a result of the issue as well. But at the end of the day, the ultimate, if you want to put actual ultimate victim here is the consumer, assuming that the consumer has gone into this without intentionally wanting to buy a counterfeit or, grey market good. And that's ultimately where the issue is, right? So it's about here. I think there's a role for everyone to play in terms of helping to develop the policy, because the issue around this is that legislation across this region is fairly nascent. It's very new. And it's developing, year on year. We're seeing new changes to countries in terms of their data privacy laws and principles. So it's part of a continuing dialogue that needs to happen, and it's probably one that needs to happen on a more frequent basis, which also connects with the broader audience. Because what is happening, I think, is that it ended up being a bit of a cookie cutter. The GDPR came out, then other countries thought, oh, this is the great idea. And they took that and lifted it and applied it to their jurisdictions without necessarily thinking through the practical ramifications. And as you know, the GDPR has had certain iterations, have had changes since, because they realised that the initial framework was too tight. So I think the dialogue needs to happen in terms of still continuing to model policy and framework changes that can help, I guess, amend, I wouldn't say amend, but, help to help develop the actual application of legislation. That's the first thing. The other thing I think is important to recognise is that each country has a different approach towards the issue and its enforcement, regardless of what framework of laws is in place. So it's important to understand what that practical application looks like on the ground and how each player can actually help in that piece. And I look at China, for example. China is still touted as being one of the world's largest, I guess, exporters of counterfeit goods, into various markets. And Alibaba has very openly been very transparent in terms of the activity it has in terms of takedown notices, et cetera, et cetera. But, Alibaba can only do as much as what it can do in terms of the evidence that's provided by its brand owners and consumers. And what people can fail to recognise is that if you don't apply a local approach to that actual regime, it can actually work to your disadvantage. And again, I spoke about making sure you've got the actual the IP protection framework in place to start with. For example, trademarks, if you need that, copyright registration where that's required. But it's also, for example, understanding what your platform's policy is in terms of being able to list goods and identifying where there's issues. It's not just going in and hitting them all with a stick, cease and desist letter, et cetera, you've breached my trademark, because that can actually work against you, because in trademarks, a first to file process, and you can actually then put yourself forward as being the one that's infringing your own trademark in that country. You know what I mean? So it's all about making sure you actually understand the landscape and the framework you're dealing with. And Alibaba, I know, works on a point system. So each notification that's given results in a point being put against the online retailer. So once it hits a certain amount of points, then Alibaba will take action to actually take down, because they consider it to be of a gravity that, they've now accumulated enough points to breach the policy. So again, as part of the strategy, what it means then is, for people that are identifying issues, you need to go in with not just one notification which lists 8 different breaches. It's actually going to have to be several notifications, and building that relationship with Alibaba, but consistently over a period of time till you actually reach the point system. Because otherwise, they'll look at your one notice and they'll say, "Oh, this is one breach." You'll never hit the requirement in order for them to enact a takedown notice. So it's about understanding, the actual law, their local enforcement, and the policy that's being applied to actually help enforce, if that makes sense. Sorry, that was a long answer from my end.
Great answer as well. So, Joy, is there anything you want to add?
Actually, it dawned upon me when the different panelists were discussing, right, that we could have oversimplified law enforcement as it almost sounds as if there's just one law enforcement in each jurisdiction. And the unfortunate thing is it is not this way. And I think in some jurisdictions, it's even at a point where it's still unclear, who is the right governing authority. So you will have a case where, for example, Alban, back to your situation, right? You identify Happy 123 shop. And then in a particular jurisdiction, it might be that, this falls within Ministry of Trade because it's an e-commerce type of crime, right? And then you go to that ministry, and then they say, but then the fundamental underlying problem seems to be an IPR issue, right? Okay, so should we get the IPR crime or some other agency or ministry involved? So then the issue just keeps getting more and more complicated, even for a case where you let's just say we identify a clear counterfeiter. So I think I just want to caution that even that one component, law enforcement, is in itself a very complicated terrain to navigate.
Great. Thank you very much. Very, very interesting. I think just to summarize a little bit before we move to the next topic, I think we identified that when we are in the kind of the whack-a-mole kind of situation, cooperation is one of the key. And we have to, one of the difficulty why it doesn't work just yet would be that, the law in different countries are kind of behind at the moment. And certainly as a platform, you relies on the law enforcement and the legal framework for your action as well. So if the legal framework are lacking behind, we can't solve the problem as well. We also bring up data sharing is one of the key as well, but the trend seems to be working against us at the moment, especially the situation where we have to gather more data in order to get the law enforcement to start the actions. Now, before I move on, I think one of the things that I want to talk further in this particular area is it's the conflict between brand owners and the platforms, right? So I think all that we talk about is good, but from a brand owner perspective, these are rarely things that they talk about, to be honest. They do talk about it, but mainly they talk about platform policy, because what they say is that, all right, in your platform, there are some counterfeit goods. I request you to take it down with no result. So this is, in a practical sense, a lot of times, the platforms would be the primary target for doing something. Let me get to one particular point is, for larger brands, I hear less feedback about this, but for smaller brands that we are aware of, they often complains that they don't want to keep complaining, but that's the only way that they can find out exactly what you will take down or not. The lack of feedbacks and I think in general, a lot of the case, because of the lack of legal framework, people are relying on the policy framework within the platforms to deal with these issues. So regarding this, I don't have any particular opinion on that, but I just want to hear your feedback, because that's what we hear from different brands. Anyone want to tackle this? Serena, maybe
I can start off this one. So thanks, Alban. So I think you brought up a very interesting topic. Fortunately, at least for Carousel, we've seen a shift from brand owners actually targeting the platform to a more collaborative position that they're actually taking, because ultimately, I think to Lily's point that she raised earlier as well, the parties are aligned in their interests, where they want to actually protect the end consumer in itself. I don't think platforms would also be, speaking for Carousel at least, we don't want to have counterfeits on our platform as well, where our user then put in a position where they purchase something thinking that it's authentic and then it's not. So maybe for some trends in relation to your point about smaller brands. So I think in intellectual property or the rights, intellectual property rights is also one that is quite complex. So we see generally bigger brands, at least on Carousel side, we see generally bigger brands having more support and more resources, where they have teams that are built up to understand the issues and what they're actually targeting. So for smaller brands that typically reach out to us, we see that there is in that sense, there is sort of this gap in that space where they are trying to enforce some of their rights, which are parked under they parked it under intellectual property, which may not actually be an intellectual property cause of action in that case. So it could be in relation to a protection of an exclusive distributorship or some other agreement that they have with their distributors and all, or them themselves as the exclusive distributors, thinking that they have the rights to actually enforce some of these things on behalf of the brand owners. So these are some of the issues that we're still working through with the smaller brands that we have seen surfacing. So I think it's just a phase where we're educating and learning as we go along, both ourselves with the different brands and the brand owners as well, on how we can actually target some of these issues and help them also understand sometimes that the platforms, we are here definitely to want to assist with it as well. But sometimes there is that difficulty because we also have to balance the rights of our users and our consumers as well, who are actually could potentially be listing authentic items, but facing these takedown notices for other reasons that may not be in some case legitimate in that sense.
So before others, just a quick follow-up question as well, and I'll just ask in general. So when Joyce and Lily, when you address this, you can also incorporate this as well. So, I understand the situation, but how do we also adjust our cooperation as a platform? Or Lily, you can in general comment on this as well. How do we adjust the program to reduce some of the problem and obstacles that we face as well? Is there a practical way that we can reduce this? I understand that there will be resource issues and stuff like that, but if this is what it is, there needs to be more communication, right, between the brands and the platforms as well. Any comment about this front?
Maybe I'll try. I'll take a first step at this. I echo Serena's points wholeheartedly. Is what we feel is also the trend that we are seeing with some of these smaller brand owners. Unfortunately, sometimes the IPR issue just gets conflicted with whole lot of other issues at play. So, and again, it's down to resource, right? Some of the SMEs, they probably the person that we're dealing with is someone who is not only looking at IPR. In fact, may not even be a legal department. It could be somebody who is a commercial a function within that organization. So there's a lot of, I think there's still room for improvement in terms of communication. So some of the initiatives that we have done in Lazada is also trying to impart the IPR knowledge, right, to some of our regional colleagues, so that these colleagues who are able to speak in the local languages, they can better explain some of these IPR concepts and policies to the local SMEs, because these are the people that have, challenges trying to understand the policy, or they have a language barrier sometimes when communicating with, say, a regional team, like someone like myself who doesn't speak Vietnamese, for example. So that's on communication and localization of that communication. The other thing, Alban, to your point, right, like how can we try and address the issue of, I suppose, the disparity that the smaller brands are feeling about their face time. At least one of the things that we're trying to do, as you see, Lazada has been trying to do, right, is to try and automate or use technology to the best that we can to allow for to accept these complaints, to accept these takedown requests. And we're constantly trying to upgrade that tool, such that, for example, now when you mouse over a complaint reason coding, there's actually a smaller description that explains to you a possible use case, and then so that the users can self-help. So I think the thing is, there's no running away from putting in the time and the effort to understand. But on the platform side, it's also about trying to localize some of these knowledge and communication, and making a tool that is online and hopefully over time can become more and more user-friendly, so that these smaller brands can effectively self-help. So that's my attempt at answering your question. Over to you, Lily.
Sure. No, that's I think really great inputs, and great question, Alban. Inputs from Joyce and Serena there. I guess coming from the perspective of an organisation that works with brand owners to try and protect the sanctity of their product and their brand identity. You're right in identifying that SMEs will have the greatest challenge oftentimes because of the fact of what they are, right? They're a smaller, less resourced outfit, but they're obviously out there to try and make their splash from the market. I think one of the critical things, I wouldn't necessarily call it a tension between SMEs and platforms, but again, it does come down to, again, remembering that each person in the chain has a role and responsibility to play to try and help mitigate and impact as effectively as possible. And for SMEs, because of the resourcing, that can be an issue. So it's very important to firstly identify the battle, pick the battles that need to be picked. That's got to be, one thing. It can't be, I'm going to try and hit every single thing that I think is going to be an infringing issue, because that is going to create unnecessary time and challenge for the organisation. The other thing is working with the actual platforms. Brand owners need to themselves be, again, communicating with their own consumers to make sure that issues are identified and notified to the brand so that they know that there's an issue to be met, and helping the brand themselves to actually collect evidence. Because, again, both online platforms as well as what we want to broadly call law enforcement can only work based on what they're informed and the evidence that's eventually provided. Evidence is going to be critical, especially if you want to be able to mount a case that is attractive to anyone, even the platform, but the law enforcement agency, because law enforcement agency has obviously many things to be worrying about, in addition to possibly, identifying these types of infringement issues. So brand owners, through their consumers, need to help collect the evidence. And there's the practical ways they can do that, hopefully without expending too much. They can actually start having samples, buying samples of that product, which could be used as part of the evidence trail. they could try to engage, there's always a chat function on platforms that you can speak to the seller on, trying to understand more about the seller in terms of even where its location is to help to identify those types of traits. There's practical things that can be done in the grand scheme of things. But remember, at the end of the day, if you are going to try and prosecute and make a good case, you need the evidence, and you need to be able to attract the attention of law enforcement to actually want to go in and take action. So that's going to be really critical as part of what brand owners working with both platform and law enforcement agencies need to do to make this system more effective.
Thank you. There are a lot of areas that I want to cover, but I think we're running out of time. But let me take two questions. I will have to ask you to keep it short a little bit. So the first question is, I want to talk about the role of vendors as well. I think a lot of the larger brands are using vendors, regardless of your relationship with the platform. They are using vendors. So in this particular picture, what do you think the vendor's role should be in this cooperation model? That's the first question. The second question, I want to address the data sharing issues as well. So we know the difficulty at the moment. So the question is, can platforms share non-sensitive data that actually useful for the brands? What are these data? Can you comment on this? So these two questions for everyone. Might be a hard question for a short answer, but Joyce, maybe you can go first.
Oh my goodness, I'm going to try and tackle this vendors question. I think thank you, Albert. I think you're right. I would actually park. Let's say it was a tripartite relationship, right? I will actually park vendors closer to somewhere in, between brand owners and platform, but closer to the brand owners. So the platforms actually have very, very close relationships with a lot of these vendors because they don't just represent one brand. They usually represent multiple brands. So we do see them as partners as well in terms of like user feedback and user experience feedback. So we do rely a lot on them to tell us what's wrong with the system or how we can make it better. And in terms of information sharing in terms of like bridging so what happens is that the brand protection manager in a brand may only be seeing like the vendor's report in vacuum, right? So I would actually advocate for or suggest or recommend that sometimes it's good for platform vendors and brands to all check in together, because then it ensures that there is alignment and that there is a clear communication. So it just avoids any kind of miscommunication pitfalls.
Yeah, and maybe, sorry, I think that was a really great response, Joyce. I think just to build on the last comment that Joyce made about, the three, again, I tend to agree, actually, the vendor's probably closer to the brand owner than they are to the platform, but they obviously have a very important relationship to play. There needs to be, I guess, a constant dialogue between the three. And the importance of that is that, again, if you want to take something really seriously and go to infringement action, the enforcement agency is only going to be able to take action if you have the brand owner's involvement. So the vendor can only do so much. They need to make sure they engage the brand owner so the brand owner truly understands the gravity of the issue, and the brand owner can then also contribute actively towards whatever needs to be done to help to mitigate the situation. Because again, enforcement can only work in relation to the brand owner. It can't work from the perspective of the vendor. There's other things that can obviously be done in terms of the relationship between the brand owner and the vendor, but that's got to be really critical here. In terms of the information sharing question, Albin, it's a good one. And obviously, being all of us being counsel here, we're not going to advocate to anyone that you share information that's going to put you at risk of breach of any law, right? So that's the most important thing. I think it's very important to understand what is not sensitive information that can be shared, and things such as trends that are being seen. For example, what I mean by trends is, if you're starting to see complaints relating to particular vendors or areas from which they're coming from, you could use that information to help try and put together somewhat of a framework to understand where certain items may be coming from, for example. patterns in terms of buyers as well, because again, this is a much bigger problem than a vendor putting something on from a brand owner onto a platform and someone buys it. Sometimes there's more in the chain. People will use platforms to sell counterfeit goods which are purchased by certain individuals who are then going to go on to another platform and then sell those goods. So it's all about trying to identify patterns of behaviour, and it's also about trying to work with customs authorities, for example, if you're talking about goods coming into country, to help them to, and that this is really important that, in terms of our interaction with brand owners, is actually interacting and upskilling the customs agencies and authorities to identify and know what they're looking for when goods are coming into country. And I think, Serena, you probably got a good example, because in Singapore there was recently a case actually, involving some counterfeit goods that were sold on a Facebook platform, originally purchased from, Carousel, I believe. So, and that individual is now, facing 4 months in jail in Singapore. It could have been much worse. So it's clear that the enforcement agencies will take an interest, but it's important that the actual brand owner, the vendor, and the actual platform and authority all have the same aligned objective and a good reason to actually prosecute.
Yep. So, Serena, anything you want to add on this topic?
So I think the ladies here have already brought up very, very good points. So nothing much here to add on, just maybe to build on to what Joyce mentioned earlier in terms of the education piece to actually bridge the gap of the resources that SMEs have seen. So I think maybe kudos to the teams around as well. We see efforts coming from both brand owners, platforms themselves, with also creating their own help centers with FAQs to help share the knowledge of what an IPR infringement could look like, or how can they themselves enforce their rights. So hopefully we'll be able to bring everyone to the same level in that aspect, but it's definitely something that, like she mentioned, needs to more effort is required, and definitely everyone is just trying to do their best at this point.
Great. I just see questions being posted on the chat. Just let me quickly skim through. So I have to read it all, but I think in a nutshell, I think the question is really about can platform build some kind of cross-platform complaint platforms? So information can then be shared, and we can respond quicker. Sorry if you're asking a question, I'm representing your question a little bit because I'm basically just skimming through. But maybe you could answer this question first.
Okay, so I think that's the utopia that we're all hoping to steer ourselves towards. And I really say it's utopia because Southeast, at least, for Lazada operating in Southeast Asia, we are in 6 different countries, 6 different sets of laws, 4 different languages other than English. So it's going to be challenging, I believe, for cross-platform, across jurisdiction. But cross-platform within jurisdiction, I think maybe some jurisdictions may have a slightly an edge over others. But I think the fact that today we have Lazada on this conference as well, together with Carousel, right? Does suggest that we do have like-minded allies in the industry. And I think that the possibility is not closed. It's just that there will be that I will not be too idealistic about it. There will be hurdles to cross, and sometimes that back to the point, Alvin, law enforcement agencies will have a really critical role sometimes to play, right, in coordinating and liaison, liaising this aspect of the data sharing or cross-platform sharing, because like Lily had mentioned, it's very hard for the platform councils to do that voluntarily. But then if a law enforcement agency were to be involved, and it will facilitate some of this sharing.
If I can also maybe just add to that, although yes, I probably raised by us as well, but to the point about how it is put while we may want to get to that stage, some of the other difficulties that we've seen that were also raised earlier is just how different the business models of all the different platforms are at this point in time. So for example, Carousel, we could have casual sellers, individuals, and whether or not how do we, with the balance of users' trust as well that they have in the platform and the sharing in relation to the being compliant with the local regulations. I think these are things that we will definitely need to consider more in detail as we try to work to facilitate maybe data sharing across platforms as well.
Yeah, I just to summarize the session before we close, I believe the legal aspect and the law enforcement aspect is one key aspect that may be very difficult to resolve. But I think the other area that might be easier for us to work towards would be the data sharing side. I think certainly everyone agree that a cooperative model would be quite important. And hopefully, after this session, there will be more discussion even on this. How do we, as an industry, with all the different players, stakeholders, can work together on this cooperative model, identify exactly what data are not sensitive but usable for the brand owners, and then we can share these data, and even maybe move to the utopia state where we can have cross-platforms data sharing as well. It's not impossible. It's really just, I think the first step is really identify what are these, how do we use it. So with this, I probably should close the session and give the time back to Rebecca.